Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Vulpine podcast. My name is Troy Hewitt. I'm a commissioning editor here at Vulpine Press, the UK's, if not the world's, finest independent publishing house, in my opinion. And I am delighted to be joined by one of our wonderful authors, Zachary Finn, who is here to discuss his debut novel, The Ancient Evil versus the Good Boy. Before we get into that, I would like to take the opportunity to say, if you are a writer and you're looking for a home for your novel, get in touch with us. We are accepting submissions at the moment, so hop on over to www.vulpine-press.com and check out our submission guidelines. And who knows, maybe in future it will be you on the podcast, but it's not today. Today it is the man of the hour, Zachary Finn. Zach, thank you for agreeing to be our test pilot for the Vulpine podcast. I'm very happy to have you here.
Well, thank you, Troy. And it is an absolute honor to be the guinea pig for the very first Vulpine podcast. So thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
You come highly recommended, I have to say. And if I could just begin with a compliment. I have read your book. Very impressed. I thought it was just fascinating from start to finish. There's some very unique moments in there that I'm sure we'll discuss. But for any of the listeners who aren't familiar with your work, could you please just begin by giving us an overview of what a reader could expect when they pick up The Ancient Evil versus the Good Boy?
Of course. So The Ancient Evil versus the Good Boy, it's my debut novel, which is very exciting. And it's been absolutely phenomenal working with Vulpine Press. But kind of the elevator pitch, when I first started writing it, at the time I was working at an animal shelter, or volunteering at an animal shelter, rather. I was in the process of moving. It was just one of those moments in your life where, you know, it's a maelstrom of change and everything's going on. And during that time, I got really connected to one of the dogs at the shelter, which is, you know, really cool and ends up being the inspiration for one of the main protagonists of The Ancient Evil versus the Good Boy. But the story is kind of, I like to think of it as a mix of multiple genres. So it's horror, there's a lot of adventure in it. I think it's a little bit of a coming of age novel as well. But, you know, at its core, it is an animal shelter volunteer who quickly befriends one of the dogs there. As one does at a shelter, you know, it becomes very difficult to, you know, not bring one of the dogs home with you. He ends up adopting it. And because it's a horror novel, soon finds out things aren't as they seem. And the dog is followed by this ancient entity. So it takes them all over. It's set in Buffalo. There's a museum that the protagonist works at, takes him to Nepal. But kind of at its root, it's about that connection between people and their pets and people and animals.
That's what makes it so fascinating in my view, because it takes you on this wild supernatural journey. And it's an international in scope, as you mentioned there. But it also seems deeply personal. And obviously, you're writing from the perspective of Jon, and Jon isn't you. But if I could just play this card, to what extent do you feel you are the narrator?
So it's funny. A lot of my friends and family who have been reading the book have been picking up on that almost immediately. But like in a lot of ways, it is, you know, a very personal story. And it was one of those books that was almost easy to write because the narrator's voice is very similar to my own. And a lot of the experiences that they're going through, you know, admittedly, I'm not as creative as I like to think I am. And, you know, I used to, you know, kickbox like the main character. You know, I volunteered at a shelter. I work at a museum. So there's a lot of those kind of personal ties into the main character. But of course, I don't have a haunted dog, so that's where I got to be a little bit creative with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to bring up the kickboxing as well. There are many references to kickboxing, sometimes just standard boxing as well. I understand, obviously, that you just say that's part of your background. But I find it's quite funny how Jon starts off and he in the novel, he's just given up, hasn't he? His kickboxing career, if you will. But then he embarks upon what ends up being probably the biggest fight of anybody's life ever. Is there some sort of metaphor here about the biggest fight being the one that life holds in store for us?
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, really kind of a perfect way to describe it. In a lot of ways, you know, I think boxing, kickboxing, you know, any sport really, one of the things that make them so important, and, we're seeing that with the Olympics right now, is it's not just the act of the sport, it's not just the act of training for that sport, but it gives you certain characteristics that follow you for the rest of your life. I think boxing, wrestling, kickboxing, all of those things, they teach perseverance, teach you not to give up, that, when things are bad, you always have another match to look ahead to. And I think that very much kind of carries over to the story, where in the beginning, with the main character, I didn't want it to be, kind of that standard arc where it starts out really rough, starts doing a little bit better, and then ultimately, there's the final climax, the big battle, the, all is lost moment. So I kind of wanted it to be a little bit of a back and forth, where in that first half of the book, you don't really know, with each interaction, who's going to come out on top. And there's a little bit of a stalemate there. And I think all of that ties into, again, sports and, anything that you work hard on, you pick up those characteristics that, help prepare you for whatever life throws at you.
And do you still compete yourself?
Yeah, more grappling now. I'm all over the place, but still training. Help a lot of my training partners getting ready for fights at the moment. So not as active as I used to be, but I'm still in the gym and, getting ready.
Do you find then, just with reference to what you said, that the discipline that you may glean from the training actually helps you as a writer?
Absolutely. And in my acknowledgments, which was actually probably, in the whirlwind of after, sending a book out to a publisher, getting the acceptance letter and all of that exciting stuff, I think the thing that was most exciting to me was writing my acknowledgments letter. You get to look back at all of those people who influenced you, and talking about the professors I worked with in college, of course, my parents and family and friends. But one of the names I mentioned was my college wrestling coach, Roger Krebs. And it's just kind of, again, you learn those skills that, when things, writing can be a very tough business. You're sending out letters, you're getting rejections often, you're writing short stories, you don't know if you're going to find a home for them. But, like a wrestling match, like a kickboxing career, like boxing, you always know there's going to be another one. And that the only time you're really kind of dead in the water is if you're not working towards that goal. So I think, again, a lot that is a big influence on my writing career.
Yeah, you build resilience, I suppose. Learn to accept some form of rejection. I guess there's also crossover with the idea of flow state as well.
What was that? Sorry.
There's some crossover with the idea of flow state as a writer, but also being in the zone in the middle of a bout.
Exactly. And I think, looking at this book, it was just so easy to write because, again, it was kind of the narrator's voice was very much my own. So I would often kind of find myself in that flow state where things are just coming quite naturally. You start typing and you're not dragging yourself along paragraph by paragraph. You start writing an idea or a scene, and next thing you know, you look down and there's 5 or 6 pages typed. It's just one of those things where very much you're not thinking about doing the work because, you're constantly reading or you're constantly in the gym training, whatever prepares you for that endeavor. And then, when you have the right opportunity, when you have the right story, the right opponent, you find yourself in that state where everything's just connecting the way it should.
Wow. The unconscious catalyst kicks in.
Yep.
Right. So just picking up then, obviously, the narrative voice it feels familiar to me. It felt like a friend, and I think that's a testament to the quality of your writing, but also the fact that it comes from a very personal place, right? So could you tell us a little bit about the narrator? So one of the things, obviously I'll leave this for your own words, Zach, but to me, as you mentioned, there's a personable feel to it. There's something very humorous about it. And in your acknowledgements page, you do talk about the self-deprecating humor that you have. But it seems that you're describing this crazy story which just unfolds over the narrative of the book into something spectacular. But it's from the perspective of some wisecracking everyman who, to a certain degree, we all feel like we can relate to. So yeah, how important is humor to you?
Of course. So just before I answer that question, I should start with a shout out. So if the character is likable at all, if he's easy to, connect to. I owe that to Jess Jordan, the commissioning editor at Vulpine Press. I think she did an outstanding job when I leaned too much in that self-deprecating humor. Just her ability to kind of keep the story moving, offer very necessary but very kind edits, I think really helped improve the quality of the book. And I think made that character much more relatable. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things, especially with the genre of horror, is there always has to be a little bit of a kind of cheeky, tongue-in-mouth component to it. Unless you're writing a very serious Gothic novel, I think, horror is, certainly my favorite genre. And when you look at movies, when you look at television shows such as Ash versus Evil Dead and the Evil Dead series, I think those ones that have always connected with me are the ones that take themselves seriously when they need to. But when they don't, they're not above making fun of themselves. And you don't want it to, turn into parody unless that's what you're going for. But when you're in a difficult situation, I know personally, like, one of the ways I get through that is, I make fun of myself, or I crack jokes, or, you got gallows humor. And I think that was a big part of writing this book, is when I try to do the elevator pitch, sometimes it just seems so outlandish and, so silly. It's a haunted dog, there's an ancient evil. It's a hard thing to discuss seriously. So I think having the narrator, acknowledge that by, self-deprecating humor, having that kind of tongue-in-cheek narrative throughout, I think makes it more relatable. And I think it's extremely important to the genre. Not every book, not every movie is going to be The Witch or The Lighthouse or these, super serious horrors. You need things like, Evil Dead 2 and 3, which is making fun of itself a little bit, but then just has these outstanding scenes, this hilarious dialogue. So that's what my inspiration was, and that's what I was going for.
Yes, and certainly in your novel, the narrative voice, as I've said, is to me, is an original voice. However, you don't shy away from a use of a horror trope as well from time to time, because that's important. Obviously, that's what drives the genre. But you do it in such a way that's kind of, you have this self-awareness that enables you to benefit from the trope. Like you are still evoking the imagery that's needed. It is creepy, it is scary. But you also get to crack a joke at its expense, which just makes the whole thing much more realistic.
Thank you. I'm glad that landed. But yeah, and I've always thought, horror, comedy, actually, let me walk that back a little bit. I think one of the things that makes horror so unique is you can have all of these influences and still have a really impactful story. So one of the, influences on this book, outside of, of course, comedy, the Evil Dead series, horror in general, is going to be travel documentaries. I'm a huge fan of Anthony Bourdain. Watch all his shows, read his books. So in the second part, which is not set in Buffalo anymore, trying to not necessarily capture his voice, but I always really admired the way Anthony Bourdain sees the world, because he's so respectful of other cultures. He realizes that he's a visitor and he's viewing the world through that lens. So I think one of the things that makes horror so unique is you can have all these influences and you can throw them together in a unique way. And then at the end, this story, of course, has to play on some horror tropes, because, you want horror fans to read it.
You want to deliver the goods.
Yep. And it can be uniquely whatever you want to create based on what matters to you.
So if we talk influences then, I mean, one of the things that I read from this, I felt at times echoes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I think what we're talking about is a marriage of the humour, but also it takes itself seriously when necessary. You've got a lot of references to Lovecraft in there. You a big fan?
Absolutely. I think Lovecraft, for all of his personal faults, and there were many, look at the influence that he had on the genre. It's really important because, even to today, kind of this concept of the unknown, or, humans are so small, when you look at the cosmic expanse and, the old gods, and you look at that whole mythology, that influence is just so important. And we see strands of that in pretty much any horror story, any book that you're going to pick up, you're going to see some Lovecraft in it. And I think what's happening now, which is so unique, is the take on Lovecraft is being, I don't want to say challenged, but you're seeing new voices look at how they can take the Lovecraft mythology and completely repurpose it. So you have like Lovecraft Country, you have, weird horror that kind of emerges from the Lovecraftian mythology. And it's really fascinating to see how, what started as a, fantastic way to tell a story, albeit flawed, has just continued to transform over time. So I think Lovecraft was a big influence in ways. One of my personal favorite short stories that he wrote is The Music of Erich Zahn. And I think what makes that short story so special is you feel like the narrator just stumbled into an actual Lovecraft story. So there's no explanation. He just kind of stumbles into this moment, this cosmic horror, sees it for a brief second, and that's his telling of the story. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to evoke with this book. Jon never really figures out why exactly the ancient evil attaches itself to Des. And I think so often when you look at the genre, when you look at real life, when terrible things happen to people, there's not a clear sequence. It's not A, B, C. Oftentimes it's kind of random, and you just find yourself thrust into this moment and you have to deal with it. And I think that's what's so unique about The Music of Erich Zahn. And I think that was a little bit what I was trying to capture with my book as well.
Are you a fan of any of the other weird fiction authors? I think of Clark Ashton Smith, if you've read any of him. Yeah, he's a personal favourite of mine from that particular group. I think there's a little recommendation for any listeners. The Vaults of Yo Vombis by Clark Ashton Smith is a fantastic bit of weird fiction. But, I digress. Big up Clark Ashton Smith. But no, so obviously we've talked about Lovecraft. Also, I would say one of your best qualities, in my opinion, having only read one of your debut novel, is your use of visual imagery. Like you're very, I would say, a cinematic writer. If that makes sense. You really painted a very effective picture, very clearly in my mind. How important has cinema been to you then as a writer?
Well, first of all, thank you. That means the world. And very important, because I think, when you're writing a story, there's always that kind of internal battle going on where you don't want to be too verbose with the descriptions, right? Like you could paint a scene and you could write a page setting up, a specific cliff in this book, but perhaps the reader's not going to, want to read about a cliff as much as I want to write about that cliff. So there is a little bit of that, continual internal battle with how much should I include. And I think with, the best cinematography, when you're looking at movies like The Shining, when you're looking at The Thing, it's that ability to capture a landscape, it's that ability to capture an emotion in a very quick shot that I think resonates with viewers. And I think at its best, that's what a writer should aspire to. And, very early in my journey, so definitely have a lot to improve on. But, when I was trying to paint some of the scenes in Nepal, when I was trying to set up the museum in Buffalo, just trying to think about, when you step into that space, if it was a movie or even if it's a personal experience, what are those things that are going to connect with you immediately and what's going to set you in that space? And, I think at my heart, I am a little bit of a romantic, and, the movies of, the early 19th, so like 30s, 40s, 50s, that golden era of holiday of Hollywood. And then certainly, shows like The Twilight Zone have always been, a huge inspiration for me. So trying to capture some of those tropes, some of those settings that they use that, just kind of stick with you. But yeah, cinematography, movies, I think shows, just being able to capture a scene quickly is, something that I aspire to as a writer.
Great. I can see that already. But let's take it back then. So you mentioned, obviously, you've sent your manuscript out to a few publishers. Eventually, you send it to Vulpine Press. And what happens then? Does Jess Jordan, our commissioning editor for horror, does she get back to you? And what state is the manuscript in at the point that it reaches Jess's laptop, shall we say?
So it took some time just because I think, again, very green, very early in my career. I think I was trying to figure out how to describe the story. And I also, there was a lot of room for growth as a writer. So I did a ton of rewrites, a ton of edits. I'm very lucky. My significant other, Natalie, is endlessly patient, and she went through and read it and offered suggestions. And she's a school counselor. She's got her master's. She's an excellent reader. So I really couldn't ask for someone better to help me, edit a novel. But I think a lot of the rewriting was based on trying to figure out where it would fit in the grand scheme of things. When I first wrote it, it was much more, I think, the humor was not subtle. It was, trying to use a sledgehammer, and it didn't read well. It was, a bad parody of the ancient Ash versus the Evil Dead, or the Evil Dead series. So a lot of the rewrites were going back through and actually making it a little bit more serious. And then, cutting out language. I realized that, whenever, there was an excess of swearing, it just didn't read natural. It didn't read like the characters. It's just kind of those edits that were, you would send it out, you would hear it back, and you would realize that, this isn't the publisher that for me, or that, they're not interested in the story, which I certainly understand, but just trying to, over time, whittle away at the excess that didn't need to be included in the story to hopefully unearth something that people want to read. Just going through the editing process with Jess was really kind of, I think, a growing experience for me, seeing what a professional editor, is looking at with a manuscript, where they're cutting, where they want you to add. So it's really just been an outstanding experience, and I'm very lucky I ended up at Vulpine.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we're happy to have you. But could maybe just to give any writers who are listening to this a bit of an idea of how long the process was, let's say from when you finally got your manuscript read by Jess and then to where we are today.
Of course. So I think one of the things, just to kind of preview that, is it was occurring during 2020, which was not a normal year. Okay. I think a lot of things were kind of, in a state of flux, and that made it a little bit difficult. But I think from, when I sent it out to Jess to when we established a publishing date and when the book was out to the world, probably about like 9 months. So it moved very quickly, but not too quickly. That was one of the things, I was always looking for, is I wanted to work with a publisher and an editor who cared about my story. I wanted to make it better. So reading through, when I got my first round of edits from Jess, at first it's a little bit intimidating because you see all those comments, but, then you realize this is what you wanted. You want an editor who cares about your book. You want a publisher who wants to fix, grammar, who wants to help make the character more relatable. So about 9 months. And again, it was kind of that sweet spot where it moved along quickly. We were constantly working on either editing the book or marketing. And again, just an outstanding experience. And it led to a book that I'm very much proud of.
Great. Right. So I think now the time may have come for you to share with us an object. So I did, listeners, I asked Zach to bring in an object which informed or inspired his writing process, or just something which represents the book as a whole to him. So now over to you. What have you got?
Perfect. So this one was nice and easy. I'll hold it up. I hope you can see this all right. So this is going to be a picture of the dog that inspired Des. Just when you're volunteering at an animal shelter, you connect with all the dogs, obviously, but some a little bit more so than others. And Des was just a really cool dog, great on the leash, just wanted to walk around and explore. And I was lucky and ended up, snapping a picture of him and saving it on my Snapchat reel. So that was, of course, kind of my inspiration for the story. And I've got my own dog, which I kind of joke around about in the acknowledgments, about being pissed that he's not the focus of this book. But this was my way of giving Des, one more adventure.
Yes, well, I'm sure it's a great one of that. You mentioned your next book. You are currently writing your second novel, I believe. Are you able to give us a little bit of insight into what that is all about?
of course, not only am I in the process of writing it, but I'm in the process of editing it now, which is, both horrifying but exciting, because at least there's, a final first draft. It exists. Now it's trying to make it good for readers. And I won't go too in depth, because I think for, my friends, my family, anyone who's following my writing career, it's going to be pretty obvious what the focus of the story is. But I grew up in Rochester, New York, and there is this amazing piece of folklore relating to the coast of Lake Ontario that I think derives from folklore in Scotland and in Great Britain that kind of carries over to New York, kind of like how Washington Irving repurposes a lot of those stories in his writing, using folklore and mythology from Europe and kind of moving it to an American landscape. New York more often in Washington Irving's case, and in my case as well. So it's my take on this piece of folklore that I grew up with as a kid that just kind of follows you along as you grow up, because it is on the coast of Lake Ontario. So you hear about it when you're in elementary school, when someone's trying to scare you. And then, of course, when you're in high school, that's where you go to bonfires and drink. And it's just this story that kind of follows you along as you grow up. But there's no story behind it. There's that basic, there's that basic components to the story, but everyone's got their own take to it. So this work in progress, this first draft, is going to be my take on the story that has followed me since childhood.
That's great. So it reminds me of, have you read American Gods or seen the show by Neil Gaiman?
I haven't. It is very much on my to read list. I just picked up Good Omens too. So, yeah.
Neil Gaiman is my man, and Terry Pratchett as well. The two of them combined, God, perfect. But with American Gods, it is, I suppose, it directly addresses the idea of stories not just following you in the sort of sense of time, but also across your sense of place as well. So stories following, I suppose, American settlers that have come from Europe, as is the case that you described there, and now they have a new life. And they're kind of etched into a new landscape as well. And who knows where they'll go afterwards. Exactly. Yep, excellent. Right, so a quick question then, right before, because I think we're coming up to the end here. Well, what do you think is the future of the horror genre? Not expecting a perfect answer, but there isn't one, obviously. But in your opinion?
So I think it is just an immensely exciting time to see all of the new voices in horror, all of the new ways to tell stories. I think this is really, it's tough in the moment when you're, constantly reading, almost to keep up with all of the changes that are happening. And I don't think you really realize it until you go to like the HWA website and you look at the new releases, or you stroll through Amazon and you look at all of these books. But I think it's just an unbelievably exciting time. You're seeing all of these new voices, all of these new perspectives. And although it's not horror, one of the books that, has really had a lasting impression on me was from graduate school when I was studying history. It's called Landscapes of History. And it's about, how we perceive the past. And one of the metaphors the author uses, John Lewis Gaddis, is that when you look at the past, it's almost like looking at a mountain, where if you're only standing from one spot, you're only going to see one vantage point of it. But the best way to really understand that mountain is to have people stand around it in a circle, because then you see every different perspective of it. And I think horror is the exact same thing. It is in some cases immensely personal. There are things that frighten me that are not going to frighten other people, and vice versa. But the best way to really have an exciting, a diverse, a changing horror genre is to have as many people writing it and looking at it as you can, because each person is going to be at a different vantage point of that mountain, and each person is going to offer their individual perspective. And I like to think we're starting to get there now. You're just seeing stories that are so creative, that are, to our conversation earlier, that are repurposing Lovecraft, that are changing the way that he viewed the world and, applying it to their experience. And again, I think it's a very exciting time to be a horror fan.
Fantastic. Right, well, we look forward to your next release. Anybody who hasn't read or received a copy of Ancient Evil versus the Good Boy, Zach, where can they get your book at the moment?
So of course, Amazon. You can go to, I believe, Fantastic Fiction. It's on, I want to say, Target. You can order it, Walmart. It is all over the place, which is very exciting to see when you Google it. But I think if you go to the Vulpine, their main website, there will be links to it when you look at the horror section.
Brilliant. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot for coming along, Zachary. Everybody, that was Zachary Finn, author of The Ancient Evil versus the Good Boy. This has been the Vulpine Podcast, Episode 1. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to do this again soon. Thanks, Zach.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Troy. It's been amazing.